The Pentagon spent more than $2 trillion building the most advanced military machine in human history, and a surprising amount of it depends on rocks America barely processes anymore. Not oil, not semiconductors, rare earths. The guidance systems inside precision missiles, the permanent magnets used in the F-35, radar arrays, electric motors in naval systems, advanced lasers, satellite communications, even some submarine technologies most people will never hear about publicly. All of it runs through supply chains that, over the last 2 decades, drifted steadily toward China, which is awkward, because the same Washington that spent years warning about Chinese strategic expansion also allowed its own industrial base to hollow itself out in slow motion. Quietly, administratively. One mine closure, one refinery shutdown, one outsourced processing contract at a time. The strange part is that this wasn't hidden information. Reports existed. Congressional hearings existed. The Department of Defense itself warned about rare earth dependence repeatedly after 2010. In 2022, the U.S. Geological Survey estimated China controlled roughly 70% of rare earth mining, and an even larger share of processing capacity globally. The processing part matters more, by the way. Digging rare earth ore out of the ground is annoying. Refining it into usable material at industrial scale is where countries either become powers or customers. That distinction sits underneath almost every geopolitical fight happening right now. And the intelligence assessment Congress reportedly downplayed earlier this year wasn't really shocking because China controls rare earths. People who follow industrial policy already knew that. The disturbing part was how deeply that dependency now touches American weapons manufacturing timelines during a prolonged conflict scenario. Not peacetime, war. There's a difference. A modern cruise missile isn't just metal and explosives anymore. It's chemistry, magnetics, precision materials science. Tiny supply chain dependencies buried inside subcontractors most voters have never heard of. One delayed input can freeze entire production lines. That's the uncomfortable engineering reality underneath all the patriotic advertising. The United States still has enormous advantages. Bigger alliances, better military reach, more advanced aerospace design. Nobody serious disputes that. But industrial resilience and technological leadership are not automatically the same thing. America kept the first one for decades after assuming the second guaranteed it forever. It didn't. And China understood something earlier than Washington did. Controlling bottlenecks matters more than controlling headlines. That's why Beijing treated rare earth refining as a national strategic industry, while most Western governments treated it like a low-margin environmental nuisance. The Ministry of Industry and Information Technology didn't build this dominance accidentally. State-backed consolidation started years ago. Export quotas were weaponized as early as 2010 during the dispute with Japan over the Senkaku Islands. Western executives saw the warning. Then most of them went right back to optimizing for quarterly costs anyway. Because markets are excellent at pricing efficiency, they are much worse at pricing future vulnerability. One of the most revealing moments came almost quietly in 2024, when defense analysts began mapping how many American military subcontractors had indirect exposure to Chinese refined materials through third-party suppliers in Southeast Asia. Not direct purchases, indirect ones, layers deep. The kind of dependency that doesn't appear in political speeches because it's buried inside procurement spreadsheets nobody reads unless there's already a crisis. That's the real story here. Not a sudden Chinese takeover, not some cinematic moment where Beijing flips a switch and American jets fall out of the sky. Reality is more bureaucratic than that, more technical, which somehow makes it worse. Aerospace firms can't instantly redesign systems around alternative materials. Processing facilities take years to build. Environmental permitting in the U.S. can drag for nearly a decade. Skilled metallurgical labor doesn't magically appear because Congress gets nervous during an election cycle. Entire knowledge chains disappeared while Wall Street rewarded companies for becoming lean. Lean is efficient until the world stops being stable. Then lean becomes fragile. There's also an irony buried underneath this entire situation that almost nobody wants to admit publicly. The U.S. military indirectly helped create some of the conditions for China's industrial rise. American-led globalization pushed efficiency above redundancy for 30 years. Companies outsourced aggressively because consumers wanted lower prices, shareholders wanted higher margins, and policymakers assumed geopolitical integration would permanently moderate strategic rivalry. Instead, China used globalization like an industrial acceleration machine. And to be fair, Beijing was extraordinarily disciplined about it. While the US financial system rewarded software platforms and ad tech companies, China kept pouring capital into heavy industry, refining capacity, mineral access agreements, port infrastructure, chemical engineering programs, and state-backed manufacturing ecosystems most Americans would consider painfully boring. Turns out, boring industries matter quite a lot when you're building missiles. There's a dry humor in watching Washington suddenly rediscover metallurgy after spending 20 years pretending the future economy would consist entirely of apps and venture capital pitch decks. But behind the absurdity sits a harder question. What happens if the next major conflict isn't decided by who has the best weapons, but by who can still manufacture them 18 months later? Because that's the timeline defense planners have started worrying about. And the answer is a lot less comfortable than most public speeches suggest. The easiest way to misunderstand this story is to imagine rare earths as some naturally unfair advantage China was simply born with. It wasn't. China has significant deposits, yes. But the country's real advantage came from tolerating stages of industrial processing that Western economies gradually decided were too dirty, too expensive, too politically inconvenient, or too unprofitable to keep at scale. Rare earth separation involves acids, solvents, radioactive waste management, ugly refining infrastructure, the kind of industry investors rarely romanticize on magazine covers. Yet modern military systems quietly depend on it anyway. That gap between what societies celebrate and what they actually require is everywhere once you start looking for it. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, American and Australian firms still had opportunities to maintain serious processing capacity. Then, prices collapsed under Chinese competition. Refiners shut down, engineers moved industries, supply chains migrated east. Washington mostly treated this as normal globalization. The assumption was simple. If materials became strategically important later, markets would adapt. Markets adapted all right, just not in America's favor. The key detail most discussions miss is that rare earth dominance isn't really about mining. It's about the middle of the chain: separation, refining, alloy production, magnet manufacturing. China spent decades building every layer simultaneously, while Western countries fragmented theirs across different companies and jurisdictions. That matters because supply chains behave like ecosystems. Once enough pieces cluster together geographically, the ecosystem starts reinforcing itself. Talent stays local. Universities train for nearby industries. Suppliers co-locate. Costs fall. Scaling becomes easier. Competitors struggle to catch up because they aren't rebuilding one factory. They're rebuilding an entire industrial environment. This is why simply reopening a mine in the United States doesn't magically solve the problem. Take Mountain Pass in California. People cite it constantly as proof America is coming back in rare earths. And to be clear, it is strategically important. MP Materials increased domestic mining capacity significantly after the US-China tensions escalated. The Department of Defense supported parts of the effort financially. There's real momentum there. But ore extraction is only one chapter. For years, much of Mountain Pass materials still required processing stages connected to China because the downstream ecosystem barely existed domestically anymore. That's the dependency loop Washington is now scrambling to unwind under pressure. And unwinding industrial systems is slower than politicians talk. A missile production line can't pause for patriotic speeches. An F-35 supplier can't redesign components because a senator suddenly discovered the periodic table during a committee hearing. Qualification standards for military materials are brutal for good reason. Every magnet, alloy, and heat-resistant component must survive extreme stress conditions. Testing cycles alone can take years. Meanwhile, China kept moving. In December 2023, Beijing imposed export restrictions on rare earth processing technologies themselves, not just raw materials. That was the important signal. It showed Chinese policymakers understand the leverage isn't merely physical resources, it's manufacturing knowledge, process engineering, industrial memory. That's much harder to replace. And there's a broader strategic pattern hiding underneath all this. China repeatedly targets choke points instead of trying to dominate every sector equally. Batteries, solar refining, graphite processing, gallium and germanium exports, shipbuilding capacity, industrial chemicals. It's not random. Beijing identified which sectors become decisive during long-term technological competition and built around those first. The US still leads in many high-end systems, especially aerospace integration, advanced semiconductor design, and military alliance structures. But wars, or even economic confrontations, are rarely won purely at the glamorous end of the supply chain. Somewhere, eventually, somebody has to melt metal. That reality became painfully obvious after Russia invaded Ukraine. American and European defense officials suddenly discovered their peacetime production assumptions were detached from modern attritional warfare. Artillery shell consumption rates in Ukraine stunned NATO planners. Factories designed for efficiency struggled to surge output quickly. Defense industries optimized around smaller post-Cold War conflicts collided with industrial-scale demand again. Different war, same structural lesson. A nation's industrial depth matters long after PowerPoint presentations stop mattering. And this is where the buried intelligence concerns reportedly became more serious than public discussion suggested. Not because China could instantly shut down all exports tomorrow, that would damage Beijing too. China still relies heavily on global markets. The relationship is interconnected. The fear is narrower and more strategic. Selective pressure, delays, licensing friction, export slowdowns targeted at specific materials, administrative obstacles that appear technical rather than openly hostile. Enough disruption to complicate weapons production during a geopolitical crisis without triggering full economic rupture. Which, honestly, is smarter than dramatic embargoes. The 2010 dispute with Japan already previewed this playbook. Following maritime tensions near the Senkaku Islands, rare earth shipments to Japan reportedly slowed sharply despite official denials. The message landed anyway. Tokyo responded by diversifying supply chains aggressively over the next decade. America moved slower, partly because the U.S. economy is massive enough to absorb inefficiency for longer than most countries, partly because finance-driven economies often underestimate industrial erosion until a crisis exposes it, and partly because rare earths sound boring compared to aircraft carriers, AI systems, or hypersonic missiles. But boring systems determine whether advanced systems can exist at scale. There's a sentence buried inside several Pentagon supply chain reviews that keeps resurfacing in different forms. Single points of failure. It sounds technical, almost harmless. It isn't. A single processing bottleneck can quietly shape military readiness more than billion-dollar weapons announcements ever will. And the deeper you go into this story, the stranger the contradiction becomes. Because the United States absolutely saw pieces of this coming, analysts warned about it after China temporarily restricted exports to Japan. Again during the first Trump administration trade disputes. Again after COVID shattered assumptions about supply resilience. Again after semiconductor shortages froze auto production globally. The warnings kept arriving. The system just wasn't designed to reward long-term industrial caution. Which brings us to the part Congress seems least comfortable discussing publicly. Even if Washington commits fully right now, rebuilding strategic mineral independence probably takes longer than the political cycle itself. And that changes how both countries calculate risk. There's a temptation to turn this into a simple morality play. America got complacent. China got disciplined. End of story. I don't think it's that clean. Because some of what happened here wasn't stupidity. It was trade-offs. Real ones. Rare earth refining is environmentally brutal if regulations are weak. Entire regions in Inner Mongolia dealt with toxic waste runoff and contaminated water systems during China's industrial expansion years. Western governments didn't just forget refining capacity. In many cases, voters and regulators actively pushed dirty processing offshore while still expecting endless access to the finished products. Which worked surprisingly well. Until geopolitics came back. That's the larger reversal running underneath this whole story. Globalization was built on the assumption that economic interdependence would reduce strategic confrontation. Instead, interdependence itself became a strategic weapon. And not just for China. The United States does this too, through semiconductors, dollar clearing systems, advanced lithography controls, aerospace software, sanctions architecture. Washington used export controls against Huawei in 2019, precisely because America understood choke points matter. The October 2022 semiconductor restrictions targeting advanced AI chips and lithography access followed the same logic. Different tools, same philosophy. The problem is that both countries are now discovering how deeply entangled these systems became before either side fully accepted they were rivals. That creates a weird kind of mutual vulnerability. China dominates rare earth processing, but still depends heavily on imported energy, overseas food supplies, and access to global export markets. The U.S. controls financial architecture and many high-end technologies, but struggles with industrial bottlenecks and manufacturing depth in certain sectors. Neither side is as invulnerable as public rhetoric suggests, and that's where the conversation gets more uncomfortable than politicians usually allow. Because rebuilding industrial resilience sounds straightforward in speeches. In practice, it collides with modern economic reality almost immediately. American labor costs are higher, environmental compliance is slower, community opposition delays mining projects, skilled metallurgists are not sitting unemployed waiting beside dormant refineries in Nevada. Industrial knowledge decays when unused. One retired engineer interviewed during a Center for Strategic and International Studies discussion described it bluntly. Once a supply chain disappears, you don't restart it like flipping a light switch. You have to recreate supplier relationships, chemical expertise, machine tooling, logistics, workforce training, sometimes from scratch. That process can take a decade, maybe longer. And during that rebuilding phase, the dependency still exists, which is why some defense planners have shifted toward a different strategy entirely. Diversification instead of total independence. Australia expanding mining. Canada scaling critical minerals. Japan investing in alternative supply chains after 2010. Vietnam and Malaysia increasing processing ambitions. Even African states are becoming arenas for strategic mineral competition now. The U.S. probably cannot fully replace China's rare earth ecosystem quickly. The more realistic objective is reducing the danger of catastrophic dependence. That distinction matters, because a lot of political messaging implies America can simply bring it all home. I'm skeptical. Industrial ecosystems don't obey campaign slogans. They obey chemistry, infrastructure, capital intensity, permitting timelines, and labor realities. And there's another issue people avoid discussing because it complicates the patriotic narrative. Consumers helped build this system too. Cheap electronics, cheap appliances, cheap batteries, cheap manufacturing inputs. The global economy rewarded low-cost production relentlessly for 30 years. Pension funds benefited, corporations benefited, consumers benefited, governments benefited from lower inflation. Entire political systems quietly adjusted around the assumption that strategic vulnerability was an acceptable price for economic efficiency. Nobody really wanted to pay for redundancy when stability seemed permanent. Then COVID happened, then Ukraine happened, then semiconductor shortages hit, and suddenly governments began rediscovering words like reshoring, friendshoring, and industrial policy, as if they were archaeological artifacts dug out of the Cold War. Even the tone changed. 10 years ago, industrial policy discussions in Washington often sounded defensive, almost embarrassed. Today, both Republicans and Democrats openly talk about strategic manufacturing capacity, the CHIPS Act, Defense Production Act authorities, critical mineral subsidies, stockpile expansion. These are not normal free market globalization policies. They're strategic state behavior returning after a long absence. Quietly, the world is moving into a different economic era. Not full deglobalization. That term gets overused. The US and China remain deeply connected financially and commercially. But the direction of travel is obvious. Efficiency is no longer the only metric governments care about. Resilience now competes with it, and resilience is expensive. That's the catch. A domestically secure supply chain often costs more than a globally optimized vulnerable one, which means eventually somebody pays. Taxpayers, consumers, shareholders, or governments running deficits. There is no magic solution where strategic independence arrives free of cost. The political challenge is convincing societies to absorb those costs before a crisis forces them to. Historically, democracies are not especially good at this. There's also a timing problem emerging that doesn't get enough attention. China built much of its rare earth dominance during a period when Western policymakers still assumed integration was the future. Rebuilding begins during open strategic rivalry instead. That means every corrective move now happens under pressure, suspicion, and accelerating military competition. The environment is harsher. And Beijing knows time matters here. One underreported detail from recent defense industrial analyses is how much future weapons systems may increase rare earth demand rather than reduce it. Electrification inside military platforms, advanced drones, directed energy systems, next-generation naval propulsion, high-performance magnets for compact motors. Demand curves may rise exactly when supply chain competition intensifies, which creates an unsettling possibility. The dependency problem might actually deepen before it improves. And this is where I think a lot of commentary gets lazy. People frame the issue as if America suddenly lost to China in one dramatic moment. That's not what happened. This was cumulative, incremental, administrative. 1,000 rational business decisions slowly producing a strategic outcome nobody explicitly planned. Empires rarely notice structural erosion while quarterly earnings look healthy. By the time the vulnerability becomes politically visible, rebuilding already requires years the system no longer comfortably has. Remember that line from the opening, about wars potentially being decided by who can still manufacture at month 18? The more analysts study modern industrial warfare, the less hypothetical that question starts sounding. The real warning inside this story is not that China became powerful. Countries rise, industries shift. That part is normal. The warning is that the United States spent 30 years treating industrial capacity like an outdated relic while assuming technological superiority alone would carry the future indefinitely. It won't. A design advantage means less if production timelines stretch during a prolonged crisis. And I think Washington understands that now. The tone coming out of the Pentagon has changed noticeably over the last 2 years. Less triumphal, more logistical, more focused on stockpiles, refinery permits, industrial throughput, and manufacturing resilience. Boring words, serious words. Because serious governments eventually rediscover physics. You cannot sanction your way around chemistry forever. You cannot PowerPoint your way around missing factories. And you definitely cannot build advanced military systems at scale if critical material chains remain vulnerable 6 suppliers deep. That doesn't mean China has already won some inevitable century-long contest. People exaggerate that too. Beijing has major weaknesses: debt, demographics, energy exposure, property instability, export dependence. The system is powerful, not invincible. But on rare earths specifically, China played the long game while America optimized for the next quarter. And the bill for that mindset is arriving now. My own suspicion is that the next decade won't be defined by a clean economic separation between the US and China. The systems are too intertwined for that. What we're probably heading toward is controlled dependency. Both sides slowly reducing vulnerabilities while staying economically connected where separation becomes too expensive. Messy, uneven, expensive. Very human, honestly. Still, there's one question sitting underneath all of this that Congress never seems eager to answer publicly. If a major conflict stretched into its second year, which country could actually sustain industrial production longer under pressure? I'm not fully certain Washington likes its own answer yet. And maybe that explains why the report disappeared so quietly. If you enjoyed this one, stick around. There are a few more supply chain stories hiding underneath global politics that matter a lot more than the headlines people usually argue about.